and welcome back to the Contrarians. This episode is another Patreon suggested topic. Ooh, sorry, my computer. Today we are doing redemption albums that somebody put out maybe after a string of poorly received albums. Maybe they hadn't done albums in a while. Maybe they tried to go grunge, which I don't think worked for anybody. But anyway, we'll see exactly what people have to suggest, and we're going to go round robin today, starting with Butch. Butch, what's your first redemption album?
The first one I'm going to go with is, I could have gone a couple places with this one, but I'll start. It's a fairly obvious one, I think. Kiss being one of the biggest bands in the world throughout the 70s, we all know they hit a lull in popularity around the time, after Dynasty. When Unmasked came out, it pretty much flopped here anyway in the United States. I know it was bigger down in Australia, but then they really, in a play for some kind of like legitimacy with the critics, put out The Elder. Now, I love The Elder, so don't send me any hate mail anymore. I love that record personally, but we can't deny that the band's fortunes like totally cratered at that point everywhere. They couldn't even tour for the record. They had plans for it. They had to scrap it. I think it's a good record, but at the time, everyone else was doing, we had the new wave of British heavy metal going, and bands were going heavier at the time, and they put out an art rock, semi-progressive kind of record, So the record that I think righted the ship, it took a while for it to be recognized as the record that it is Creatures of the Night. All guns blazing on this record. They went from The Elder, from like art rock to just full on. This is undoubtedly the heaviest record, or the most metal, I should say, that they ever made. But this album is brilliant. Everything about it, the production, thundering drums, the vocals are killer. The songwriting on here is uniformly great. I don't think there's a bad track on it. Even the weakest track is still really good. This is a top 3 or 4 Kiss record for me. It's one of my favorite metal records of all time, actually. And this was like a statement that the band was back making hard rock again. And although the tour didn't do well, and the record at the time didn't perform well, they played a lot of these songs, stayed in the set list for a while. They still play some of it. War Machine and I Love It Loud are still in there. It was a big part of their set list throughout the 80s, and the Reputations record grew. It eventually did go gold in the late 80s or early 90s. So Creatures is my first one. And I'm still, to this day, upset I went to the Kiss conventions, and I got Gene to sign it, but he used a black marker, so you can't even see it. But I know it's there, so it's hanging on my wall proudly. Creatures of the Night. That's my first one.
Yeah, that was a good one. And I also consider that one also to be kind of really Eric Carr's first album. I know he obviously did The Elder, but he really didn't to show off his chops on that. And Creatures of the Night really showed what a drummer he was.
Yeah, I know, and a lot of people have said like what it must have been like for Eric to be coming into a legendary band, and the first thing they do is do The Elder.
Right.
The guy's obviously he's a power drummer and chomping at the bit, and that's what they go and do.
Yeah.
Well, the newest person in the band doesn't get to choose, do they?
No, definitely not. Not at that point.
Okay.
Not ever,
Butch?
because probably.
Oh, I'm supposed to go on to the second one. Sorry.
Oh, no. We're just going to do one at a time.
One at a time.
We're moving on to Parish of Rock now. No relation to the Elder of Rock.
Not that I know of. I don't know. What did our tree?
Before I say mine, I've got to agree with Creatures of the Night as well. It was one of my honourable mentions.
Yeah.
It did quite well in the UK, actually, because they weren't that big in the 70s, and it kind of came at the same time as the new wave of British heavy metal. So it kind of struck a bit of a chord over here. So it was quite a popular album. And certainly from that album onwards, they became a lot more popular. So, and it's got a cracking album cover as well. I think it's one of the better ones. So
Tremendous, yeah.
Oh yeah.
probably my favourite Kiss album, although it ties with Destroyer maybe, but I think it's probably my favourite. Okay, well, the first band I'm going to go with, and I've picked this band partly because they're one of my favourite bands, and partly because it's the lead singer's birthday today on the day that we're recording this.
Oh.
And it's Slade. So Noddy Holder is 78 today. So I couldn't really not pick them on the basis of that, and they're one of my favourite bands. So Slade, very big in the 70s, certainly in the early 70s here in the UK. Lots of number one hits, number two hits, successful albums, disappeared over to the States to try to break America. Never happened for them over there. And then released a few albums in the mid to late 70s with Nobody's Fool, Whatever Happened to Slade, and Return to Base, both of which I think are really, all four I think are really good, particularly Return to Base, which is one of my favourites. And they were on the brink of splitting up. In fact, they had effectively split up, and Dave Hill, who's the guitarist, had actually started using his Rolls Royce that he bought in the early 70s to go and do weddings. He was a wedding driver. And then in 1980, they got a call to fill in for Ozzy, who was ill, to do Reading Festival. And Dave Hill didn't want to do it, but they persuaded him to, and the rest of history, really. Went down a storm. It's still talked about today by rock fans in the UK. So I suppose the redemption was really the concert, but the album that followed was put together, was a bit of a compilation of B-sides and tracks from EPs called We'll Bring the House Down in 81. And their first proper album after the Reading Festival was Till Death Do Us Part, which came out in 81. And it's a cracking album. It's really good. It's probably their heaviest album, a bit like we just said with Kiss. It was just about the time of the new wave of British heavy metal. The fans at Reading that particularly liked them was the heavy metal fans. So they did an album geared for the market that was bringing them back. Tracks like the title track Till Death Do Us Part, which opened the set from 81 onwards. Rock and Roll Preacher is a fantastic song. Lock Up Your Daughters was probably the big hit off the album. Ruby Red was another single. Bizarrely titled single was also Knuckle Sandwich Nancy, which is actually a lot better than it sounds. So I think it's a fantastic album. It was definitely the redemption album, although Reading was really the redemption. And it went in the charts as an album. They had several hit singles, and it put them in a great place for the rest of the 80s, really. Had a number of hits in the 80s with albums and singles, even over there with you guys in America with Run Runaway, they finally got a hit. And finally broke up, unfortunately, in 1990. Dave Hill still tours. Don Powell, who's the drummer, still releases records. In fact, he released a single recently with Bev Bevan on the song as well, which was quite good. And Jim Lee is making music, although Noddy Holder's become a bit of a celebrity over here in the UK, appearing on TV, appearing in sort of comedy programs, that kind of stuff. So he's almost moved away from music into just becoming what we would call a national treasure over here as a celebrity. But remains one of my favourite bands, and the redemption album is Till Death Do Us Part in 1981.
Okay. One of these days I need to check out Slade. I've just never listened to them. Okay, let's go over to the younger, I believe, even though he's the elder of rock.
Yeah.
What's your first redemption album?
This one is going to be a band that did a couple of albums that were all right, but they kind of veered away from what they were doing. I'm talking about Judas Priest. They did Turbo. They Ram It Down, which was them trying to redeem themselves, but they still didn't hit the mark. But then they come back, they get a new drummer with Scott Travis, they do Painkiller, and just prove that they are, again, one of the godfathers of heavy metal. And just a blazing album, opens up blazing, Scott Travis. Sometimes I think these albums, when they get new members. It's also like a bit of a comeback. And Scott Travis opening that and just being on that album, and that was just a blazing album for them and a really good comeback. And they've kind of, except for maybe with Nostradamus, they haven't really strayed away from being what they are since that album.
Okay, so Painkiller.
Yep.
All right, one of the new
That's
Judas
a good
Priest,
choice.
probably the most influential Judas Priest album on the power metal crowd in Europe,
Oh.
and one of my favorite Priest albums as well. Okay, all right, so I wanted to try and avoid the really obvious picks, but I couldn't help it. At least they're obvious to me. So my first one is one of my absolute favorite performers. He just put out his most recent solo album just a couple of months ago. And I'm talking, of course, about Bruce Dickinson, the lead singer of Iron Maiden. So as people may know, oh, it looks like Jeff is joining us. As people may know, Bruce first put out Tattooed Millionaire in 1990. That was not a planned thing. He said people approached him and said, "Harry, here's some money. Why don't you put out a solo album?" So he did, but he hadn't really intended it to kick off a career. And then he had a falling out with Iron Maiden over the course of the recording of No Prayer for the Dying and Fear of the Dark, and he split because he wanted to see if he could make it on his own. And he went off and recorded apparently an entire album of, as he describes it, spooky Peter Gabriel type music. Most of those songs have been released now as supplementary tracks on other CDs. And then he scrapped that entire album after hearing a band at a local venue with guitar player Roy Z and his tribe of gypsies, and re-recorded an entire album, which was Balls to Picasso.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting album. It has some good songs, but it's very stylistically different than anything that Bruce ever did. And it had no commercial success at all. So he tried again. This time he got a brand new band, got a grunge producer, and he put out the closest thing Bruce ever had to a grunge album, which is Skunkworks, an album that I hated when it came out, but it's really grown on me over the years, and now I love it. Nonetheless, something stylistically completely different. At this point, Bruce has self-financed basically 3 albums. It's taken a lot of money. He's had no commercial success. And as he puts it, he was about ready to throw in the towel on everything. And Roy Z called him up and said, "Look, man, let me just play you some stuff over the phone." And he played him some riffs and said, "Why are you fighting so freaking hard against being a heavy metal singer? That is what you are. Pull your head out and do a heavy metal album." And he put out Accident of Birth.
Yeah.
And I adore this album. I love every track on it. It's heavy as hell. It's fast. It's slow. There's great dynamics to the guitars, to the vocals, great lyrics, which Bruce is still writing responses to the lyrics that he came up on this album. There are several allusions to lyrics from this album on his most recent album, the Mandrake Project. So I find that very interesting. But nonetheless, a hardcore heavy metal album. Oh, and of course he got Adrian Smith to be second guitar player, which came as quite a shock to everybody apparently. But Adrian wasn't having much success going grunge. I told you, going grunge didn't work for anybody. If somebody can think of a heavy metal band that successfully went grunge, leave it in the comments. I drew a blank on that. Yeah, anyway, Accident of Birth, fantastic album. Probably still, even this is so weird because I think Chemical Wedding is his best album, but I like this one better, even though it's not his best album. Go figure that one out.
Yeah, it's weird how that works sometimes. You're like, the other one's the best, the better album, but you still have your favorite, which maybe is not better, but you like it. So
that's right.
I agree with you. Yeah, Accident of Birth. That was like his kind of comeback album too. Is he, like you said, proving he's a heavy metal singer. And it wasn't like being Iron Maiden either, and that was kind of good too. It was enough away from Iron Maiden. It doesn't sound a lot like Iron Maiden. And that was really good too. That that album, about that album as well.
Yeah, still allowed him to maintain his own identity. Okay, Jeff, we're going to work you in here. We're going round robin. The initial thing we're going to do are three redemption albums, and then we'll see how much time we have left. So if you want to start off with your first, now's the time.
All right, and I'd just like to apologize for being late. I didn't realize that we were starting this early, and the time had gotten away from me. So I'm going to go with Hawkwind Levitation. They had a bunch of changes throughout their history, but then at some point they started doing that. Lemmy left, and they started doing that Hawklord stuff, and they just kind of got soft in a way. I mean, I'm not trying to make a moral judgment here about what they should be doing or what they shouldn't be doing, but I just didn't really like the albums after Warrior on the Edge of Time up until Levitation, where they just really reinvented their sound. There are a couple good songs on there. Corpse Day, Strangers and Charm is a great song, but I like it better live later when they are using their newer sound. But Levitation, to stay on track here, Levitation, they went completely in another direction, much harder, very, very kind of 80s sounding. And the guitars all sounded different. And it felt like they really had gotten some kind of inspiration, because there was a lot of sprawling stuff on those middle 70s albums, and it just didn't seem focused. I guess maybe it'd be how Martin would put it. But Levitation, they came back pretty hard. And there's some really tight, good stuff on there. And it's probably my favorite later period Hawkwind, post-Lemmy, essentially. Though my favorite Hawkwind album is pre-Lemmy. So, it's not a Lemmy worship thing. I love Motorhead, but that's not what I like about Hawkwind. But it's just a convenient way to demarcate the periods of the band. So that's what I'm going with. I think Levitation was an amazing, not even a return to form. It was a new form. They said, from now on, space rock's going to sound like this. They haven't. They've eased up on it a little bit. It's gotten a little more wandering again in the later few albums. But, Dave Brock is like, what, 70, 80, something like that. I got nothing to say about how hard he has to play, or how hard the tracks have to be. But they kind of defined their sound for a number of decades to go onward from that one album. Hi, Kitty. You got a cat behind you, Reed.
Yeah, I have two actually, but yes, that's Rusty. Okay, very good. Now, with five of us on the panel, I think we're at the tipping point where going around one album at a time is going to add length. So we're going to do two albums on the next one. So, Butch, what are your next two redemption albums?
All right, I'll go with this one. In the 80s, probably around 82, I guess, is when I first started really getting into metal. So those years from 82 through, 90 are like my big days for, I'm nostalgic for a lot of that stuff. A lot of the bands that I got into at the time, are still stick with me. And so a lot of the stuff that I heard for the first time, I got turned on to by local college metal shows. There was one out of Lehigh County Community College. The station was WXLV. The DJ was named Kamikaze Craig. He was on, I think it was Wednesday nights, couple hours of metal. So this is where I'm first hearing Merciful Fate. This is where I'm first hearing Metallica and stuff like that, like Omen, like Lizzie Borden, like stuff that, if I wasn't paying attention to who there were like just bands like TT Quick, like just band after band I'd never heard of. Anthrax before a lot of people knew, who they were. So, but Sabotage, was one of the bands I got into, and this is around the time of Power of the Night. So my buddies and I, we went out and got that one. We used to play it all the time. The title track's brilliant. Warriors is killer. I love that whole record. It's just a full, like the cover is that, the raise the fist to the metal child, the fist to the face on the kind of the fist on the front of the record cover. And then inexplicably, they follow it with a record called Fight for the Rock, where obviously the label said, you're going to do a commercial record and like it, or you're in trouble. And they put it out and it fell on its face. It's got a few good songs on it. Like, honestly, I like that record better than the stuff they did with Zach Stevens, but that's for another day. But anyway, the point is the record did terribly. And then seemingly people were forgetting about them. Then out of the blue, they come up with this record. And this is probably one of the greatest heavy metal records ever made. Right here. I mean, they followed up Fight for the Rock with a vengeance. Like every song on this record, 24 Hours Ago, kind of quirky and heavy. Beyond the Doors of the Dark, especially like live. Some of the stuff live was just like, it had a darkness and a almost an evil to it, that maniacal kind of thing that wasn't there before. Legions is great. Strange Wings, although it has a lot of melody, I think it's a great song, but still like, heavier than what we got from them in the last record. And then of course the title track is monumental. The whole thing, White Witch, is fast, and Devastation, that just the riff in that is killer. It's kind of, there's like a Sabbathy thing flowing through some of this record. And on tour, I mean, these guys were like crazy good. Like they would like blow your doors off live. I saw them headline, I saw them open for Megadeth, and they just laid waste to Megadeth. It was like one of the most intense things I ever saw. So that's my second one. I still think it's the best record they ever made. And definitely also, like I said, one of the greatest metal records of all time. And it followed like a record that most people consider their worst and one of like the biggest flops in metal. So the other one, wasn't sure where to go, but I'm going to go here. One of the early bands I got into in the early days of MTV, even though they started in the 70s, and that's when they had their main success. When I was first getting into music, and I discovered MTV at my grandparents' house one summer and would watch it to the point where they wanted to kill me and throw me out in the streets for not being out in the sun. But I got into She's Tight by Cheap Trick. I used to sit and watch for that video to come up. I loved it. And then my mom's cousin, a couple doors down, had At Budokan. So these are the things that like launched me into Cheap Trick. I went out, I bought One on One. I had At Budokan. Cheap Trick was one of my bands like throughout the 80s. And you could watch. I watched it in real time as their fortunes like went like this. One on One I thought was great. Next Position Please was really good, but it didn't do well. And then Standing on the Edge is a little harder rocking, but again, the band just wasn't doing that well. And they came out with The Doctor, which is, I don't even know what to say about that record. It's rough. But compared to what came next, even that record is preferable. And then they totally like Tom Peterson came back, which was great, but they come out with this record that sounds nothing like the Cheap Trick that people that love them loved. I mean, it's like the turn that Heart made in the 80s. Like it's just an AOR kind of record. It's soft. It's not, I don't think it's particularly fun. It's too produced. That song, The Flame, is awful. I don't care what anyone says. They should take it out of the set list. The guys in the band even hated that song, but it did revive their career in terms of commercial. So I'm thankful for it, but I think that album stinks, and so does Busted. Busted's got one or two songs on it that make it worth kind of having. But so to me, in terms of quality, that was the dip for them. Like the worst they ever did, the worst material they ever did. It did revive their fortunes. Artistically, they started writing the ship with Woke Up With a Monster. It's a little bit more rockin'. The songwriting maybe isn't there quite as sharp on this one, but what really did it for me with them, and I think like has made them popular on a different level and let them keep their career going as long as they have and get into the Hall of Fame and continue their influence, is this record here. from 1997. Just again, self-titled, back to the black and white, like the first record cover. I mean, this album is more, it's less produced. It's fun again. There's some really rocking. 8 Miles Low on here, like rips, like a really rocking song. Yeah, yeah, it's kind of like the Cheap Trick that we knew. There's really catchy like songs on here, like Anytime is great. Hard to Tell is good. You Let a Lot of People Down is really good. Say Goodbye is a great song, like really, like at a different time. Had that song come out in the 80s, I think it could have been a bigger hit for them. But this album set off a string of records that I think has been like pretty uniformly pretty great since this record. So the comeback here is not, I mean, their fortunes didn't change in terms of, after Lap of Luxury and Busted, they dipped again in terms of popularity. But I mean, artistically, they've been killer since this one, and they're still like a consistent band on the live circuit, like either like headlining smaller places or opening in arenas for bands like Heart. So that's my third one.
Okay, very good. And I have to agree, Fight for the Rock sucks. I like that song. It's a terrible album.
I don't go as far as sucks. Like I don't know. I have a nostalgia for some of it. Like I like that song. I like Hide, and I actually like the cover of Day After Day. But compared to the Zach Stevens stuff, like I'll take that record any day over any of that. But that's just me.
I'm a big fan of Edge of Thorns. We can do that another day.
Yeah, I mean, John Oliva not singing is not Sabotage to me. That's just my opinion.
Fair. I'll buy it. All right. Parish of Rock, give us your next two selections, please. You're muted, sir.
Before I do, I've just got to agree with the Cheap Trick choice. Again, that was one of my honourable mentions. And that 97 or Red Ant, whichever title you want to give the album, I think is one of their best albums. I actually saw them on that tour. Over here, the only way you could get the album was to actually buy it at the gig. So I went from one end of the country, I was living up in Scotland at the time, all the way down to London to see them and get the album. But yeah, brilliant album. And I think it did reset the dial for them from being critically acclaimed, and people sort of, the music press and the hardcore fans, I think, came back to them in droves after that. Mm-hmm. And I've seen them every time they've come over since. And I think that is, from that album through to the current one, it is one of the best run of albums. So I think that's a fantastic choice. The one I'm going to pick next is actually not dissimilar story, I guess. And I'm going to go with Billy Idol. So my history with Billy Idol started with Generation X. I love Generation X. He then released the albums in the early, throughout the 80s, really. Released 3 albums, starting with this self-titled debut, which had White Wedding on it, for instance, had a number of hits through Rebel Yell and Whiplash Smile. And then Steve Stevens left, who was his guitarist. And I think it went downhill after that. It certainly went downhill from a point of view of sales, but I think it went downhill from a point of view of quality of albums and songwriting. So he released Charmed Life in 90, Cyberpunk in 93. And during this time, he was all drugged up. He had a motorbike accident. I can't remember the complete time frame to all of this, but he had a motorbike accident and nearly killed him. He then disappeared off the scene altogether to bring up his son. And then came back in 2005 with an album called Devil's Playground, which I think is absolutely fantastic. I mean, it's probably his best album. The whole album sounds like a greatest hits. If you like Billy Idol's hits, but maybe got fed up with them hearing them on the radio, then it's definitely worth buying Devil's Playground, because it's kind of got the same sound of the hits, but it hasn't got that over familiarity. And it's got great songs like Super Overdrive, Rat Race, brilliant pop song. If this was another show that we did recently, I might even say it's a power pop song called Cherry. That's really good. And then he disappeared again, and then came back with Kings and Queens of the Underground about 10 years later. Another fantastic album. I should have mentioned with Devil's Playground, Steve Stevens was back. So it's definitely there's definitely a chemistry there, both in the songwriting and the fact they get the best out of each other. Live, I saw him live through the 80s. I saw him live in the 90s, even though I didn't like the albums, but he wasn't particularly good live. Well, I saw him twice in the 90s, and he wasn't particularly good live. But Devil's Playground, he was fantastic again, and there's no doubt, as I say, Steve Stevenson's creates that spark with him. Kings and Queens on the Underground, Bitter Pill is a fantastic song, the title track. Can't Break Me Down is another up-tempo rocker. And then in the last few years, he's done a couple of EPs. So The Roadside came out in 2021, 4 tracks, again, really good. And The Cage came out in 2022, 4 tracks, really good. So I think the problem for him, as in Billy Idol, is not having Steve Stevenson. I think the two of them together is what the magic is. And the redemption, even though even though commercially it wasn't particularly successful, the Redemption album came with Devil's Playground in 2005.
Okay, very good. Go ahead and do your number 3 too.
So yeah, the next one.
I should say as well. Your 3 as well.
Yeah. So I'm now gonna go to Australia. I'm gonna pick Jimmy Barnes as my next one. So Jimmy Barnes was in Cold Chisel in the 70s. He then released a series of albums through the 80s, which again I think are fantastic. Body Swerve, For the Working Class Man, Fate Train, Heart. Two Fires came out in 90, which is a really good album. And then he kind of lost his way. He decided he wanted to be Michael Bolton, so he did a number of soul covers, which I don't particularly like. It was a big hit in Australia, but I certainly don't like it. He then released some average albums, like a lot of artists do. There might be 1 or 2 good songs on those albums, but overall the albums are pretty average and poor. So he released Heat, Cyclone, Love and Fear through the 90s. Through the early 2000s, he went back to sort of cover versions, re-recording his own songs, sometimes as acoustic, sometimes with guest singers. And to be honest, I kind of lost interest in him, and I thought he was basically a busted flush. That his heyday was long gone. And then 2019, he brought out what I think is his best record, or certainly his second best record, which is called My Criminal Record, and it is so powerful, so gritty. It's probably his heaviest album. It's got political statements on it, like shutting down this town. I'm in a Bad Mood is a really powerful, sort of rocker. It does a fantastic cover of John Lennon's Working Class Hero, and he does almost a prog, which for those who know Jimmy Barnes would think it's odd, but he does almost a prog rock song in a song called Stargazer. So an absolutely unexpected return to form, really 30 years after what I thought was his last good album. So if you like Jimmy Barnes, or you know of Jimmy Barnes and kind of like some of his stuff, I'd definitely recommend the album. It's really good.
Okay, thank you very much. And then I don't know if any of you guys are computer gamers, play a lot of computer games. Billy Idol made a surprise appearance in a game called Elix 2. Just out of the absolute blue, it's a science fiction game, and then they have a fully animated performance of Billy Idol doing this, I think, Whiskey and Pills. I was like, what the hell? Yeah. That is so random. I don't know what the connection was, but it was, nice to see him. Even on computer animated form.
And I don't know if you know that Billy Idol, he was scheduled to be the T-1000, or no, the Terminator in Terminator 2, the other guy that went to I can't remember, Robert Patrick, but then he got in that motorcycle accident, and that's why he couldn't do it. So,
well,
that would have been interesting.
All right, Elder, give us your next 2 picks.
All right, the next one I'm going to choose is Anthrax Worship Music. Of course, they had John Bush for a little bit. They did an album called Sound of White Noise, but then after that album, they kind of went downhill. Dan Spitz left, and they were kind of playing musical chairs with guitarists. But then they got another singer, Dan Nilsson, and they had recorded this album, Worship Music, and then he ended up having problems with him, and I can't remember what they were, but so anyway, and they had already had one failed reunion with Joey Belladonna. He was brought back, but then he left. That's why they got Dan Nilsson, and then that didn't work out. So they got Joey Belladonna back, and they did Worship Music, and it was an album that we waited a long time for, and we were wondering, is it going to live up to, it's live up to it, because it's been so long. Sometimes you wait a long time for an album, it doesn't live up to its hype. But actually, it turned out to be a really good album. It brought them back, and they've been doing pretty well since that album. So yeah, that's the other one I have, Worship Music.
Okay. Worship Music's a great pick. It was one of my honorable mentions, in fact. Have you got one more?
Yes. So this last one's pretty recent, and this is going to be weird because I consider it a comeback album, but now I don't know if it's going to be because of what happened in recent month, and that's Skid Row, The Gang's All Here. They got they've had musical chairs with a few vocalists. They got this guy, Eric Grunwald, I think is his name, how you say it. And great singer, very, sounds a lot like Sebastian Bach. That album is a really good album. And was a comeback for them. It got really a lot of good reviews. The concerts were getting good reviews. And then, of course, he had some health issues and he had to leave again. So now Skid Row is back to being singerless. They had Lizzie Hale fill in for a few gigs. But, yeah, so I don't know if this was going to be the comeback now, because now they got to get another singer. And whatever style he's going to be like, I don't know. I doubt if they're going to get Bach back. That's just pretty much a no-go. So that's my other one, Gang's All Here, Skid Row.
That's a good pick. That's a good record.
It is a really good record. It's a shame that he's not going to be with the band anymore, because I really was looking forward to seeing more material from that lineup.
Yeah. Anytime you have a band that goes through a whole lot of people in a certain position, you really wonder if the problem is the people or the problem is the band.
Well, I think in this case it was health issues for Eric. He had leukemia in the past. Ooh. And so he's had to watch his health a lot, and I guess traveling the world and having a depleted immunity system kind of is maybe not too good for you, at least at this point.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that having a bad immune system has ever been good. Okay.
Yeah.
If you like Birk Elder, he used to be in a band called Heat.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
Really good.
Yeah.
It's a good band.
I'm not familiar with Heat. All right. I've got, for my next two picks, I decided just to stay with a couple of my favorite artists. So anybody that has a long career probably doesn't have just an up and a down. And it was funny, I was discussing, my wife was like, well, why don't you do David Bowie? And I was like, well, which one of his up and down cycles would I pick as his comeback album? Because he's up and down all the time. The Rolling Stones are up, and anybody that's put out 15, 16 albums, you can just, they're not all going to be of a consistent quality. So I just went with a couple of my personal favorites. One of my all-time favorites, again, being Mr. Ronnie James Dio, R.I.P. So the 90s were not particularly kind to Dio. He had his infamous falling out with Vivian Campbell, who left. He brought in Craig Goldie, thought Dream Evil was a fine album. It was a good tour. Then he boots Goldie to the curb, and he gets in this literal kid named Rowan Robertson, puts out Lock Up the Wolves. I don't think it's a terrible album, but it's certainly not as good as the albums that preceded it. I think it did better in Europe than it did in the United States. He goes off and does an album with Black Sabbath, or wait, is the Sabbath album next? I get the timeline just a little mixed up. He decides it was next. That's what I thought. And he decides that he wants to fit in with the new heavier landscape. And again, he has said in interviews he would talk about bands like Tool and Napalm Death, which I think are interesting inspirations for Ronnie. And he put out Strange Highways, which is an album that I love. This is one of my top 3 Dio albums. But again, a lot of people did not like the change of direction. Then he did a contractually obligated follow-up in Angry Machines, which I do not love. I don't hate it, but it's one of my least listened to Dio albums. Then he kicks Tracy G to the curb, and he gets Craig Goldie back. And they decide to put out a concept album. And they do Magica. Well, I could do an entire show about Magica. I happen to like Magica. About mid-level. It's not his best. And when you add in the stupid robot voices and Ronnie reading that absolutely terrible story he wrote, I'm so sorry, Ronnie. You were a good lyricist. You were not a fiction writer. And the story of Magica is terrible. And listening to him read his story at the end of the album always just bums me out. And I thought, well, I wonder what old Ron's got left in the tank. And then he kicks Craig Goldie out again. Or maybe Craig leaves on his own. I mean, I don't know what the internal band politics were. And he gets in Doug Aldrich, and he puts out this absolutely slamming album called Killing the Dragon. And this, even though I actually like Strange Highways better than I like Killing the Dragon, this is a very good return to form. If you like Last in Line, if you like Holy Diver, this is the album that kind of stylistically most follows those up. So even though Doug did not get to write the songs, they were actually written with Craig. The guitar work on this album is amazing. By now, Ronnie really had something to prove, as Ozzy had stolen his band again, and Black Sabbath was off conquering the world on their reunion, and he had to show that he still had it. And I absolutely love the album. It's just got some fantastic classical Dio material on it. And sadly, I don't think Master of the Moon was a particularly great follow-up to be his last album, but I do love The Devil You Know, the one album he put out with Heaven and Hell. But Killing the Dragon, this is a fantastic album for any Dio fan.
Yeah, I love that album, but I think what was weird is that I think shortly after that album, Doug Aldrich went to Whitesnake, and I think Craig Goldie did that tour.
They swapped off back and forth actually for a while.
Doug definitely did part of the tour because I saw them with the Scorpions and Deep Purple, and Doug was there. The only time I got to see Dio as Dio with that band, but they were really good.
Yep. I saw him on that same tour, once with Doug and then once with Craig. So it's really interesting. Doug's done some interviews recently talking about the timing of all of that and how he almost ended up talking himself out of any gig going back and forth between those two guys, but he ended up with Whitesnake. All right. And finally, for my last, I'm going to another favorite band that I don't talk about very much. I'm not really sure why, but we just don't talk about them very often, which is interesting given the circles that we run in. That's going to be Megadeth. So this is another band that I think I could have picked probably 3 albums and said, this is their particular redemption album. But I'm going to stay with their most popular arc of music, which was in the 1990s. Of course, they put out Rust in Peace, one of the all-time classic speed metal albums. I still love, Dave said he didn't come up with this slogan, but the marketing materials called them the world state-of-the-art speed metal band. I thought that was a fantastic marketing slogan. And then they came out with Countdown to Extinction, which was his attempt to answer Metallica's Black Album. It's more accessible, but it's still pretty heavy and very Megadeth. And it sold more than Rust in Peace, which was a much more straight-up Megadeth type album. So now he's starting down the slope, right? So they put out Euthanasia. Euthanasia has a couple of songs which actually make it on the radio because now, hate grunge or love it, grunge was responsible for getting a lot of heavy music on the radio, whereas before, metal bands couldn't, they couldn't bribe somebody to play them on the radio in a lot of markets. So Euthanasia, I remember seeing that tour. The previous tour, they were in jeans and concert shirts, and on that tour, he was in leather pants and a puffy pirate shirt, and I was like, oh man, Megadeth they have changed. He's up there playing
the puffy shirt.
He's like playing a timpani. Bum, bum, bum. but it didn't do as well as he would like it to have. So rather than going heavy, he goes more commercial again, and they put out Cryptic Writings. And he has a couple of songs which are very successful, but as he put it, he hit number 2. I'm not sure which, it may have been Use the Man or Trust. Anyway, he had a song go to number 2, probably on the rock chart. I never bothered looking it up. A lot of times artists just talk a lot out their butts anyway. But that made him decide that commercial, he was right to go as commercial as possible. They put out Risk, an album that at the time he was talking in interviews about being inspired by Fleetwood Mac, and he was, Megadeth was a hard rock band now, and this album was like a screen door in a submarine, baby, just right to the bottom.
Garbage.
So some people might argue that The World Needs a Hero is their comeback album. I think this was a desperation album. They got in Al Pitrelli, who Al's a great guitar player, but I don't know that he really fit in with Megadeth. I saw them on this tour. It was just after 9/11. The atmosphere was very strange, to say the least. And it didn't really connect, and I don't think that it really had Dave's best material. He more or less just disbanded the band. He had injured his arm. He didn't know if he was ever going to get Megadeth together again. And then apparently in the midst of all of that, he decided, screw it. For one thing, I have contractual obligations and I still have music to put out. And somehow he got together The System Has Failed. And I'm going to call this their comeback album. Not commercially successful, but he got Chris Poland back to play guitars on it, which everybody was like, oh, he's bringing Chris Poland back. I do not think this has Chris Poland's best work on it. I respect Poland a lot. He's an astounding guitar player. But he was a hired gun for this. Apparently some bad business right after recording this album. He sued Dave for unpaid royalties. And, that's just the way bands go. But nonetheless, this was an unapologetic heavy metal album with songs like Kick the Chair. What else we got? Of Mice and Men, Shadow of Death. This album really did bring them back to straight up heavy metal. And then they kind of were heavy metal and they begin the long slope down and then they go up again. So I think Megadeth has had their ups and downs multiple times. But for this show, I'm sticking with The System Has Failed. This was really the album that brought them back just before they put out all the reissues of their previous albums. And every single time I liked the original album better than the reissues.
Yeah.
Don't know what that says about Dave's taste in remixing or my taste as a music fan.
Yeah.
All right, Jeff, you're going to wrap it up for us. Have you got 2 more picks?
Oh, sure, and some honorable mentions. And actually, I think I do not have The System Has Failed. I have not heard it, and I might have to go check that out. Because I do have some earlier Megadeth, and I do like them. Sure. So my next one is going to be, so Halloween comes along, kind of invents power metal. And they put out Walls of Jericho, and it's amazing. And the Two Keepers, there's some self-indulgent stuff in there because Halloween is really long, but it's cool. And I think everybody was kind of on board. Everybody liked that. And then it was time to get weird. And I actually like some stuff on Pink Bubbles Go Away, but I don't know what to do with the one after that. I just don't. I don't know what Kiske had in mind. I'm confused. But then, they fire him, they fire the drummer, which turns out to be kind of unfortunate because he doesn't live long after that, I guess. But, they bring in Andee Darius, I don't know how you pronounce that. And Master of the Rings is, once again, we're focused, we have new sound. They run that sound for quite a long time after that. And, it's not the Kiske band, and that's too bad, but that band had run its course. It was done. So that wasn't an option. So I pretty well like the next several Halloween albums after that. I think they really forged a new thing, and it was worth listening to.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I agree with you. Master of the Rings, that was a good album. Because I kind of fallen out with them, and then I heard they had a new singer, and that kind of makes you skeptical. But then, it was a great album, definitely. Back to
Definitely,
metal,
those first four with Darius are great. That Time of the Oath, and then
Yeah,
Better Than Raw, and The Dark Rider. Those
right.
four records are all tremendous.
Yeah.
yeah, I really like The Dark Ride. There was some good stuff on that. And then after that, I kind of lost as much interest as I had. There's still some good songs, but it felt like they kind of run for about as long and had a lot of things to say, and then it was just kind of like, well, we're still here.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, not that it's bad, but it just wasn't as strong. And for my last one, I'm going to go a little bit outside of, we don't talk about this much. So we all know who Stephen Stills is. But we probably don't all know what his solo career looked like because, who's paying attention to that? Well, so he had, first couple solo albums were really good. And, then there was some other stuff. He was always in and out of CSN and, played the one time with Young and the Stills Young band. And eventually, I think that, Thoroughfare Gap was a bit odd, but had some great stuff on it in '78. And then it got kind of quiet. And then Right By You comes out. It's like one of the first digitally recorded albums in '84. And, okay, congratulations for that. But the songs are kind of... And then you don't hear anything from him for 6 years. And then in 1990, he puts out Stills Alone, which is him and, as far as I can tell, Martin with extremely new strings on it. It's super bright. I mean, there's just, it's a kind of a festival of string noise is what it is. But, it's cool. It's a sound. And it's just him and the acoustic, and it's actually pretty good. He's not trying to do anything weird. He's not doing anything experimental. He's just sitting down there and playing his songs and some covers and whatnot. He does a Hollis Brown on there. And it's pretty respectable. It's like, yeah, okay, he's still got it. Now, what he does after that, it continues to not really, it doesn't exactly turn into a relaunch of a career exactly. But for those of us who like Stephen Stills, and I would be one, it's a nice thing to have that it came along that late and it was still pretty good. So that's my other one.
Okay, very good. Love to get a little variety thrown in there. Okay, and we're almost at an hour, so actually I'm going to skip additional honorable mentions, and we're just going to leave it there. So there's a whole group of different bands that have had redemptive albums. I really do like those first Andee Darius albums with Helloween. I have this urge to listen to Time of the Oath again. I may do that after we finish up. So thank you everybody for participating. And anybody watching this on YouTube, thank you very much for watching it. Check out the Contrarians' other videos. There are a lot of interesting chats. We have a lot of people who love music, and we just enjoy talking about music. Check out the Patreon, all that kind of thing. And we will see you on another video very soon. Guys, thanks for coming in today and talking music with
everybody.
Love you guys. See everyone.
See you.
All right.
Cheers.
Bye.